When a healthcare death raises serious concerns, people often ask, is this a matter for the coroner, the police, or the criminal courts? The answer can be all three. Today's conversation is set against the background of the Lucy Letby case, which has brought renewed public attention to the role of the coroner. The aim is to help our viewers understand how inquests work, what their purpose is, and how they sit alongside criminal proceedings. Stay with us until the end when we will tackle some of your specific questions.
Welcome to Spoken Injustice, where we put the criminal justice system in the dock. Inquests can feel complex and intimidating, especially when they follow a high-profile criminal case. Our aim today is to explain the process clearly and in a way that's accessible to anyone encountering it for the first time. To help us with that broader understanding, I'm joined by Stephanie Davies, a former coroner's officer with experience of inquests, including cases where criminal proceedings have also taken place. Stephanie, thank you very much for joining us. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to our Spoken Injustice community.
Hiya, thank you for having me.
I think many of our listeners will already be familiar with you, but for those who are not, could you start by telling us a little about yourself and your background?
Yeah, so I'm Steph and I've been investigating deaths for 20 years in February, it will be, so that's flown. I've got an academic background in forensic psychology, forensic science, more recently forensic medicine, and I'm currently working on a doctorate in manner of death determination of staged crime scenes and equivocal death. So 20 years ago, I started as a coroner's officer for Thames Valley Police. I then went back home and joined Cheshire Police as I grew up in Cheshire, I live in Cheshire, and I did just over, 16 years with Cheshire Police, and I was promoted twice. I won a couple of awards and became very passionate about the role. It's something that it's so rewarding to get answers for families, and it's so intellectually stimulating as well. I wanted to be a detective, but I couldn't because of my hearing loss. I was born deaf, so I couldn't pass the medical to join the police force. So when I came across coroner's officer, I thought, actually, I could do that. So I could be a police civilian and still investigate, despite the fact I've got this disability that's holding me back. So I did that, and since leaving the police, I did become a whistleblower, so that didn't sit well with my former employer, so my employment ended with them. But I still investigate deaths, I'm still doing what I'm so passionate about, and I'm now helping families and lawyers with complex cases.
That's really impressive, and thank you for sharing that, and congratulations on everything you have achieved so far.
Thank you.
Now, turning to our main conversation, I thought it would be helpful to break this episode into three clear sections. In the first section, we will explore in general terms, the role of the coroner and what the coroner's court actually does. In the second section, we will look more into how inquests relate to criminal proceedings. And in our third final session, we will focus on the upcoming inquest connected to the Lucy Letby case to help listeners understand the process and what to expect. So starting at a general level, can you explain the coroner's role and what a coroner's court is there to do?
Yeah, so coroners are independent judicial officers. So they are inquisitorial. So they seek the truth as to how somebody came by their death. So they investigate all unnatural deaths. They're not necessarily suspicious, but unnatural. So suicides, accidents, things like that, misadventure. And their role is to hold an inquest into all unnatural deaths or deaths where the cause of death cannot be ascertained. So even after a post-mortem examination, or if somebody dies in state detention, like prison or mental health setting. So the coroner has that judicial function to hold inquests into those cases. Now, not every death is reported to the coroner. It's only when certain criteria is met. For example, if they've had an operation, which has then possibly led to the death, that has to be reported to the coroner, and the coroner has to investigate if that was an iatrogenic death, so if it was medical treatment related. All death certificates are now scrutinised by medical examiners, so that's different to the US medical examiners. So in England and Wales, medical examiners, they scrutinise medical cause of death certificates, and that's born out of Shipman, basically, because he found a loophole in the system, and that's how he got away with his crimes. But the coroner will investigate those unnatural, sudden, unexpected deaths. And the coroner also has a duty if somebody has been murdered or it's a suspected homicide. The coroner will still have a judicial function, but the criminal court process will take precedence over that. And that's where it starts to get a bit complicated. In terms of coroner's officers, they are responsible. They are investigators, they're inquisitorial investigators. They used to be police officers, and for a long time, and they still are to a certain extent, retired police officers. So those that have had a lot of life experience and they've experienced that trauma and they've investigated it and they've been able to remain professional. I was quite unique when I started because I'd just done my forensic science degree. I'd had my master's in my forensic psychology, and I'd also done a month's work experience with NYPD. So I was attending murder scenes. I was shadowing their homicide detectives, and I also was trained in blood spatter analysis. So I'd had some of that life exposure, and so I think that was the main reason why I was able to become a coroner's officer. So inquests are not heard for every case. So sometimes there can be a discussion between a coroner or coroner's officer and a doctor, and then the coroner will allow the doctor to issue a medical cause of death certificate. So the coroner's involvement is very limited. Or other times, deaths will be reported to the coroner because the cause of death is not known. So it could be someone that's not seen a doctor for years. They've been absolutely fine, and then suddenly they've been found dead in bed, for example. Doctor won't be able to issue a medical cause of death certificate because they've not been seen for so long. So a coroner will order a post-mortem examination, which could be invasive or non-invasive. There are more non-invasive types now. The coroner may find there's a natural cause of death. So that means the coroner is not required to carry out an inquest hearing. So notification will go to the registrars. I've had a post-mortem. This is natural causes. My function is now over. And then the family would register. So for most cases, it's quite straightforward. And I know we'll talk about Lucy Letby's case and Operation Hummingbird. That's not straightforward. And we'll touch on that later.
Indeed. And actually focusing on death occurring in a healthcare setting, what typically determines whether it is referred to the coroner and indeed proceeds to an inquest?
So all doctors are given a list of criteria. So if any of those points are met, they must report the death to the coroner. So for example, if somebody maybe attempts to take their own life and then they're taken to hospital, then they die a week later, that is arguably an unnatural cause. So the coroner has to investigate. It may not be suspicious. It may be that it's a suicide-related death. So the coroner has to look into that further. Also, we can have a case where someone may have been exposed to asbestos in their occupation, and they then develop something called mesothelioma, which is a type of cancer that is strongly linked to asbestos exposure. So that then would need to be reported to the coroner. So it may be that the cause of death is due to a type of cancer, and most cancers are thought to be natural, but this would be different. This would require investigation by a coroner to ascertain, was this industrial disease related? So a lot of hospital cases or healthcare related cases that end up going to inquest may be where there's a question mark over the medical care. So it could be an operation or procedure that's gone wrong, or it could be that the family have raised a number of concerns and that is relevant to the cause of death. So that would then need to be explored by the coroner. There could be other reasons as well, but I think most hospital cases that end up as inquest hearings, assuming that there's not something else that's happened prior, such as a road traffic collision or suicide attempt or asbestos related, if they've gone into hospital with a medical condition and then died in hospital, then the coroner has to be informed that it's probably related to medical care or systemic problems.
I see. That's very interesting. And can you briefly walk us through how a coroner's court hearing usually works from opening to conclusion?
Yeah, so a coroner will be notified about the death first, and a decision will be taken whether a post-mortem is needed or if the coroner goes straight to an inquest hearing. They don't always have to have post-mortem to go straight to inquest. It all depends on if the cause of death is known. It becomes more complicated for those cases which could end up with criminal charges. Then you're looking at probably a forensic or home office post-mortem. But in most cases, let's assume that they don't involve the police. So purely a coronial investigation. The death will be reported, a post-mortem may take place, then an inquest is open to allow the funeral to take place. In some cases, if it's straightforward and it's unlikely the evidence will be disputed, then the coroner may do a read-only inquest, so an open and close inquest at the same time. So that means that the coroner's function will be over quite quickly. The coroner's officer would get basic statements, and they probably would give evidence in a hearing, which might just be the coroner's officer and the coroner in some cases if the family don't want to attend. But in a lot of cases, especially for some more complex cases, the inquest is opened and then adjourned. And then ideally, the legislation that coroners work under is the Coroners and Justice Act 2009. Yeah, so, and that stipulates inquests need to be heard within 6 months. So sometimes it's unavoidable. Complex cases will go over. As long as the chief coroner is kept informed, this is why it's gone over the 6 months. That's the important thing. The chief coroner, before I forget, is senior to coroners. A chief coroner is somebody as a judge who provides judicial leadership for all coroners in England and Wales. And they can oversee some investigations, and they provide national guidance as well. They set the national standards. So there can often be communication with the chief coroner, especially for very complex cases that go over the 6 months. So, and then that 6 months will allow the coroner's officer to gather evidence. So obtain medical reports, it gives enough time to get the post-mortem report back, if toxicology was needed, toxicology findings. Statements will be required from the treating clinicians, so consultants, if surgery took place from the surgeon, so all the relevant clinicians. As a matter of course, the GP will provide an overview of the past medical history. The coroner's officer will obtain a statement from the family and any relevant witnesses. So, for example, if someone had a fall at home or in a care home, they broke their hip, they went to hospital, had surgery, and then they died. So statements would be needed from the staff at the care home or whoever witnessed the fall. So it's quite an in-depth investigation, but it's not to apportion blame or criticise. It's to look at who the deceased was, where they died, when they died, and how they died. Those crucial 4 things have to be looked at by the coroner. So that's what makes that type of investigation different to a police or criminal investigation. And at the actual inquest hearing, so you got all the evidence, you got the inquest file, witness notices are sent out, you'll have live witnesses, so often the family will be asked to attend and they will confirm registration details of the deceased, so who they were. By then, identification will have already been confirmed before the inquest is open, so that would already have been done. And antecedent history. So it all depends on the cause of death, and that's how the statement is shaped. For example, if it was a suicide attempt, did they have any previous suicide attempts? What was their demeanour like before they were found and before they went into hospital? And then the care in the hospital may be covered. Were you satisfied with the care and treatment in the hospital? And then other live witnesses may attend. So treating clinicians, consultants may attend. If there was police involvement, a police officer may attend to say, this is the overview of our our investigation. And this is why we did not find any suspicious circumstances. So they would need to state how they managed to rule out the death was not suspicious.
No, even prosecutors can sometimes be summoned to attend.
Some more complex cases.
Yes, that's right.
And also the coroner can read out documentary evidence. So especially when there's unlikely to be questions from the witness. So a GP report, for example, so many of those tend to be read out unless there is something to do with the treatment by the GP that may have led to the death, and the GP probably would need to attend. And then the coroner will summarise and then give a conclusion. So it used to be called the verdict, but the coroner, it's a civil standard of proof. So it's a coroner's conclusion now. Since the Coroners and Justice Act, it's no longer verdict, it's now conclusion. Because the coroner cannot apportion blame or criticise, it's inquisitorial.
Great. And now you have touched very briefly upon that already, but turning on to our second section, how do inquests differ in purpose from criminal proceedings?
So inquests are inquisitorial. So you've got the coroner, coroner's officer investigating, but criminal investigations are done by the police. So their scope is I guess widened. I mean, they have to still consider how did this death happen, and is this a homicide or is it manslaughter, is it murder? They have to look for, is there a crime or isn't there? And then once they believe they've got enough evidence, then it goes to the CPS, and then the CPS will decide, right, we're going to prosecute or not. They have to look at and I'm sure you've told your viewers this all along, they have to look at the evidential threshold. Has it been met? And is it in the public interest to prosecute? So the roles differ, but they can exist side by side. But because criminal courts have a higher burden of proof, if there's a criminal investigation, then any inquest proceedings, coronial investigations do have to be put to one side. And therein may be a problem when it comes to cases such as the Lucy Letby case. But in most cases, it's not a problem. And if there's been a criminal court hearing and the person's been found guilty of murder or homicide, manslaughter, in effect, the coronial conclusion has been determined. It's a matter of public record that the death was an unlawful killing. So you wouldn't need a separate inquest hearing after a typical murder case. You would not need one because it's already, all the facts have been examined in a criminal court. But in some cases, you may need a separate inquest hearing. So, for example, let's say somebody who had physically abused their partner, they spent a short amount of time in prison for an assault. They then threatened to kill their partner on release. And apparently, people in the probation service weren't told, the partner wasn't warned that they were going to be released and that there were threats against her. And then if that person then goes out and then kills their partner, then there's a criminal trial. You've murdered this person, you've been found guilty. But then what happened? What about, not telling the probation service or not warning the partner? What about those? They weren't looked at the criminal court. So they're systemic issues. So therefore, the coroner, because it's related to the death, the coroner may have a judicial function to examine those issues. But the coroner's conclusion can't contradict the criminal conclusion, the criminal court conclusion, because it's a matter of public record. It's already been decided. And again, this is where we have a problem with the Lucy Letby case.
Yes. So the main difference in a nutshell are, first of all, the purpose is not to apportion blame, but to find out how somebody died. The second point is the standard of proof. So whilst in the criminal court, the standard is beyond reasonable doubt, in an inquest, the standard is in the balance of probability.
Yes.
And then the fact that the inquest is inquisitorial rather than accusatorial as the criminal proceedings.
Yeah.
And that is my point, where thinking of a possible reform of an inquest is important. It is true that the standard of proof is higher in a criminal court. However, the criminal courts have got lots of specific and very strict rules on admission, which the inquest wouldn't have. And therefore allowing an inquest to freely look into evidence that the criminal court, for any particular reason, procedural reason, has not explored, it's
Yeah.
important. Otherwise, there is no point to have an inquest at all.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a very good point you make there, actually. Yeah, there are. I mean, my expertise is not to do with the criminal court system. So, but you're right about the strict standards of what evidence can be acceptable. And yes, that differs in the coronial inquest, absolutely.
We will look more into it with the Lucy Letby case because I still don't understand what is there to do since there have been verdicts, but we would look more into that. And what are the limits on what the coroner can say or
Yeah.
determine when a criminal case has already taken
I
place?
mean, yeah, like with the Stephen Port case, so that's the person who murdered at least four young
Yes.
men in London. And there had been a couple of inquests already with open conclusions. And so those inquests were quashed after the criminal trial, and then a separate inquest was held, and they found failings with respect to the police investigations. So those failings were not covered at the criminal court because that was all to do with Stephen Port, whether he was guilty or not. So yeah, that was a very important inquest hearing, that fresh inquest hearing that identified these failings. And even though the coroner cannot apportion blame, the coroner can identify problems where there's a risk of future death. So with the Stephen Port case, the coroner then issued a prevention of future deaths report with respect to the police investigation. And the coroner expressed concern that there was a lack of professional curiosity when those deaths were investigated, because there was the assumption made that there was nothing suspicious about them. And that's when the professional curiosity just switched off. And they weren't thinking, how did these men die?
Yes.
They were like, there's no crime here, there's nothing to see. And then things were missed. And they actually missed the crime because of that lack of professional curiosity. So that's where the inquest becomes very important. But you'll know that the coronial conclusion it's still unlawful killing. Yeah, so it can open some doors, it can examine some issues as long as it pertains to the cause and the manner of death. So, but the Lucy Letby case, yeah, I don't think we've seen this before. The situation that
Yes,
we're in.
indeed. And now it's the proper timing to move to the heart of today's episode. So, focusing on the forthcoming inquest connected to the Lucy Letby case, can you explain the scope of the deaths the coroner will be considering? In particular, are you in a position to clarify whether these are the same deaths that were examined during the criminal proceedings or whether they pertain to the deaths that have been referred lately to the CPS or a mixture of the
Yeah.
two?
It's hard for me to answer that because I don't know, because I no longer work for the Cheshire Coroner. Sadly, I do miss that job, but we are where we are. I think it's helpful to look at what happened before Operation Hummingbird started. So if we take into account the babies that had died that were on the indictment, so I think 7 were found to have been murdered and 1 was attempted murder, so 8 in total. Out of those, 7 paediatric postmortems had taken place and 2 inquests had already been opened. So that was for baby A. Baby A's inquest was heard and closed in October 2016, and that was a narrative conclusion. Well, I'd say it was an open conclusion because it can't determine, and the actual wording, I think this is printed in one of the Thirlwall documents, so I'm not giving you anything confidential. This is all publicly available. So that verdict, well, the conclusion, I should say, was it cannot be determined what caused child A's collapse and subsequent death, and further, it cannot be determined whether this was due to a natural or unnatural event. That inquest has already been opened and it's being closed. Now, I don't think baby A is going to be one of the babies. I mean, an inquest has already been opened, so you're not going to open that again. I don't know if there's been any pressure on the Cheshire Coroner to quash that original inquest conclusion. There would have to be an application to the High Court. So it may be that at some point in the future, if there are inquest hearings, which it's not very certain that there will be, although I know September's been quoted, but I don't know if that's an automatic thing, because coroner said tend to set dates when they open inquests, so that might be an
Yes.
automatic thing. So Baby A's original inquest conclusion would need to be quashed by the High Court so that the coroner can then have a short hearing and then find unlawful killing. So we don't know what's happening with Baby A, but Baby A won't be open next week because that inquest is already opened. And then we've got
Yes.
another one that has been opened, I believe. That was Baby D. Now that was arguably a natural cause of death, but I think there were care concerns, and I think potential lawyers were involved as well. Now, that hearing was due to be heard towards the end of May 2017, but I remember it was pulled at the very last minute because of Operation Hummingbird, so that was cancelled. Well, adjourned. It was adjourned. So that, I don't think Baby D will be opened either because it's already been opened. It is set for an inquest hearing. So I don't think that'll be part of it either. And then there was one case, so Baby E, a medical cause of death certificate had been issued for that. So there's never been a coroner's post-mortem. Inquest has not been opened. Coroner's investigation has not been opened. Now, the chief coroner would need to give permission for the Cheshire coroner to now open an inquest. So it may well be that Baby E is one of those. And then we've got 3 cases that had paediatric postmortems, but those coroner's investigations were discontinued because the postmortems found natural causes. Those were C, I, and K. So now, should further information come to light after a coroner's post-mortem, inquests can be open. So I think they will be open next week. And then there were still 2 active open coronial cases, O and P. There is, again, documentation in the Thirlwall inquiry, so I'm not passing on anything confidential. Those cases, I remember the Cheshire coroner at the time was considering discontinuing those investigations because the cause of death appeared to be natural. But I remember that we were waiting for the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health report first before we were going to discontinue them. By the time all that happened, then there were concerns raised by the Countess and the police got involved. So those 2 cases are still open. I suspect that those inquests will be opened next week. Now, as to why inquests were not opened back when Lucy was charged, the normal process would be the CPS confirmed charges, then the CPS informs the coroner, by the way, we're charging this person for suspected homicide of these cases, and then they'll give the names and the details of the deceased. The coroner would usually, they've not already opened an inquest, they would probably open an inquest and then adjourn it sine die. So without a day, so without any plans on having a formal inquest hearing, because it's thought that the criminal court will cover exactly how, the deceased died. So there should be no need for a separate inquest hearing. Now, I don't know if maybe the coroner held back from opening inquests in 2020 because Operation Hummingbird was still ongoing. So there was a chance that other babies would end up needing inquests being opened. And it may be, I actually think the reason inquests are being opened now is because Operation Hummingbird has now stopped. It's now ended. The CPS has said no to further charges. So Operation Hummingbird, in effect, that investigation is over. Then I know the coroner's office have said to the press it's coincidental. I think it's because it's Operation Hummingbird's now finished. There's no other babies to add to the list. The coroner now has their list. They have a judicial function. It's a public record that they were unlawfully killed. So the coroner is now probably under pressure as well, maybe by the families. We want another, this is unlawful killing. So there is the problem that we have.
Indeed, but there is one, if I have not misunderstood, there is one death that occurred at the Liverpool Women's Hospital, which was not part of the indictment cases. Am I right?
I believe so. I don't know what that case that is. So if the death happened in Liverpool, it's a Merseyside coroner that would have jurisdiction. So what they do is if it's linked to, events happening at another hospital, then that coroner, Merseyside, Liverpool coroner, will transfer the case to the Cheshire coroner. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's happened already. They'll have had a discussion. Cheshire coroner will say, okay, I'll accept the transfer. And so the Cheshire coroner will have jurisdiction over the death that happened in a different area to the Cheshire coroner. So I don't think that baby was on the indictment at all, but I don't know about that one. And I don't think it formed a part of my original review. back in
If it is,
2017.
we know that the CPS had considered one case from the Liverpool hospital and has given a no charge decision. If that's the case, then the coroner presumably will be free to get
Yeah,
any decision, because there
and
is
that
not
makes it
a
very
very
interesting, very
yes.
interesting. And recently Lucy's been given interested person status, which is her right. So that can mean even if the coroner can only give unlawful killing, that means that Lucy, via her representation, has a right to disclosure of documents pertaining to the cause and manner of death. So that'll include the Liverpool case, has a right to ask witnesses questions. So it does come with a number of rights. Now, I know with the public inquiry, Lucy was denied interested
Yes.
person status. Now, I'm not an expert in public inquiry, so I don't know. All I know is that when it comes to coronial inquests, absolutely anyone that's been accused of a crime, whether they're culpable or not, they are an interested person. So she's got that status, which is good. But what I don't know is that there are actually going to be inquest hearings. Now, the Liverpool one is very curious. I think if that one, in effect, that hasn't got a public record conclusion already, so that's not been unlawfully killed. So the coroner will have to have a full inquest hearing for that one, which would probably involve the evidence that the police had provided to the CPS.
The CPS, that's
And
right.
that's when it becomes very interesting, because it'll then be interesting to see how weak that evidence was, because it must have been weak. It didn't meet the threshold for the CPS. And if it's at the same sort of standard as the original charges, convictions, then that puts a massive question mark over the previous ones. And I think Cheshire Police, they didn't help themselves by being so defensive publicly against the CPS, because it kind of demonstrated, well, we thought it was strong enough, we know it was strong enough. And CPS has said, and this is a higher level in the CPS as well, the more senior.
Yes,
It's almost like the
that's
grown ups
right.
have stepped in now and gone, hang on a minute, that's not strong enough. And now people are wondering, was it the same caliber as the original? And we're already lots of questions are being asked about how strong was the evidence. It wasn't strong, it was circumstantial. Things have been twisted in the criminal court. Pajamas already. The Netflix documentary has proven that Lucy Letby was telling the truth about what she was
Yes,
wearing when she was
yes,
arrested. And the prosecution must have known, and the police would have known, that the prosecution barrister was probably lying. And he was really goading what was arguably a vulnerable defendant. That's not
yes.
right. Is this where
No,
our judiciary has gone? That is not right. Even
absolutely, I agree with
if
that.
Lucy was definitely guilty, it's still not the right way to treat people. It's still,
Absolutely.
even if she'd done everything she's been accused of, even if she definitely was guilty, I still find it very concerning to storm into somebody's bedroom, to put handcuffs on her. You see her crying, cuddling her cat. That, you see her trying to reassure her parents. That is not a serial killer. That is not a psychopath. That is not even a sociopath. This is someone with high empathy. The
Absolutely.
police have got her completely wrong. She's not evil. And I found
You
it.
don't need a psychology degree to understand
Yeah,
that.
so you don't need a master's in forensic psychology to
No,
recognise that. And
absolutely.
I'm almost dreading the Netflix documentary, because it's voyeuristic. Cheshire Police searched my bedroom. They took private things from my bedroom. They then turned those against me when I was under investigation for effectively being a whistleblower. What do they do to this poor girl? So I think the Netflix documentary, it might open some people's eyes as to what this police force are capable of.
Yes.
Anyway, I'm digressing a little bit.
Sorry, I don't make any comments on those because we tend to focus more
Yeah,
on the criminal
that's
justice
fine.
system.
You want.
A police that it's used for entertainment purposes. It is a disgrace to a criminal
Oh,
justice
God.
system. So
It
that
is.
is of interest to us
Yeah,
indeed.
yeah, yeah.
So let's now look at another issue. Do inquests of this scale and complexity tend to take longer And what factors influence how long an inquest may last? We haven't focused on the timing of the inquest yet.
All depends. I mean, let's take an example from other cases where there has been fresh inquests following criminal court hearings. So Robert Trigg, somebody who murdered two of his partners, those cases initially thought to be non-suspicious, but eventually it's found that he had actually murdered them. The original inquest for the second victim of accidental death was quashed by the High Court, and the coroner proposed holding a short inquest to record that victim two had been unlawfully killed. So they don't have to go through all the details because that was covered by the criminal court. So they just wanted to do a short hearing to confirm that the second victim had been unlawfully killed. But then you've got Hillsborough. So Hillsborough was massive. That went on
Yes.
for a long time. And also, I don't know how long the Stephen Port fresh inquest was. Again, that I think that would have been quite a lengthy one.
And there
So
was more than one anyway, wasn't
yeah,
it?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And it's very difficult. I remember even before inquest being opened was announced last week, I remember thinking for Baby A, has that original inquest conclusion been quashed yet by the High Court? And I made some notes for myself. I wonder if anything's been done about that. So
Yeah.
but now we know it looks like I don't think it has been. I think the press would have reported it by now if it had been.
Yes.
And I don't think Baby A is going to feature next week at all. If the coroner decides to have full hearings, yeah, maybe. But it's quite difficult to answer. So I don't know is a short answer.
Then also there is some conflict with the dates because I
Yeah.
understand I saw the Guardian, I think it was, that said the 4th of February,
Yes,
but then
yeah.
there's been the times, I think it's behind paywalls, I don't pay for that, so I'm afraid I don't know that, that I said it will be September, is
Yeah,
that?
so today, pre-inquest review, that's closed to the public and the press. So that will be to look at terms of reference. It might be all to do with next week, who are definitely interested persons. Have we done everything we can to prepare? So I think that pre-inquest review will just be to maybe look at the scope of next week. Now, next week is just opening inquest, so that'll be to confirm names of the babies. Obviously, there's reporting restrictions, so those can't be published. But the names of the babies, how identification was confirmed, that will probably have to be featured as part of it. There may be reference to the cause of death, and that's where it gets a bit murky. So we've got the original coronial cause of death, and then we've got the criminal court cause of death. And I think they're going to have to go by the criminal court cause of death because that's a matter of public
Yes.
record. They may require a police officer to give a very short statement, an overview. We did an investigation, and then this person was found guilty of murder, or whatever. I don't know. I'm not too sure if that even should feature as part of an inquest opening. So I expect it's not going to examine the evidence. That's not the purpose. It's just to formally open, and in most cases, the inquest will be adjourned sine die, so no intention of holding full hearings. But a date has been set in
Sorry, can I
September.
just say for our listeners, sine day means just in case for people who don't know
Yeah, so
that.
without a day, so no confirmed day. But yes, it's the Times that reported that dates have been set for September. Now, when inquests are opened, coroners will now set a date, usually within 6 months. So I think that was done automatically. So I don't know if Cheshire Coroner intends to hold full hearings, but the Liverpool baby, I think she's going to have to. So maybe that's just for the Liverpool baby and not the others. I also think the criminal court did not sufficiently cover how these babies died. Because as we know, the main prosecution witness who came up with these new cause of death, he's since changed his mind about baby C. Like, I don't think that's a method at all. I think it was something else. But then the judge at the criminal trial said, it doesn't matter how they died, you just need to be certain they were murdered, which is a bit questionable. So arguably, the cause of deaths have not been sufficiently covered by the criminal trial. So there should
Also,
be an inquest hearing to look at, and
yes, we
therefore,
understand that with baby, there was a procedure that was not disclosed to the coroner, wasn't there?
that's correct, yes. Now, we don't know if that procedure caused the death, but it may have hastened the death. So there could still be an iatrogenic contribution. The coroner was denied the opportunity to explore that potential contribution. So not saying, I mean, the baby, I think it was done during resuscitation. So something's caused the baby to become very unwell anyway. So, and then this procedure was done, arguably it was erroneous. That wasn't reported to the coroner. In my view, it should have been, which is why I spoke out about it. But the coroner was denied the opportunity to explore if it had contributed or not. And that's what makes me concerned, that the hospital have withheld relevant information from the coroner. And then, you know, they can't account for all of these multiple deaths. And then suddenly, next thing we know, they're saying we've got a serial murderer here. And then the police have just adopted that narrative, and they've not looked beyond. They've not looked outside the box. They've not looked at the bigger picture. They've not questioned, have these consultants got a motive? It's that they're not very good, and they're trying to divert the blame, or, you know, because they don't want their units to be closed down. It's easier to pick on somebody more junior, and right, who knows? I think there's allegations that consultants have not been honest with respect to the evidence they've given. And as far as I'm aware, those allegations are not being investigated because it goes against Cheshire Police's narrative. And they don't like that because it makes them look stupid. So therefore, they'll probably ignore, they'll probably refuse to investigate these very, very serious allegations of perjury.
Absolutely.
You know, and then it makes you think, are they doing it for truth and justice, or are they doing it to protect their reputation? I know what I think, but...
Yes, indeed. Now I've got a $1 million question. How do you ensure an inquest remains independent and fair when there has been intense public and media attention in a case like the Lucy Letby case? Is there a way, in your view?
Inquests have to be independent anyway. Coroners are independent. But it's a bit of a blur. If it ends up that there are full inquest hearings, I'm sure the Cheshire Coroner would do it justice, absolutely. But I am a little bit concerned because of the close proximity of Cheshire Police, and as I understand it, my replacement is now a senior police officer. So I don't think they want to risk a senior coroner's officer being a civilian. So again, I would be questioning, is there a conflict of interest there? If they've got their senior coroner's officer who is a senior police officer whose loyalty is with Cheshire Police, is there a conflict of interest? And my hope would be, if there are full hearings, that a different coroner or a judge oversees them and looks properly at the cause and manner of death. So completely, I mean, I have to stress the Cheshire Coroner is independent from Cheshire Police. I have to stress that. But she's reliant on her coroner's officers who are being led by a senior police officer who will have loyalty to Cheshire Police. So I am a little bit concerned that there could be a conflict of interest, but I am an overthinker and I'm probably overthinking it. That's what my hope would be. To open the inquest, no, Cheshire Coroner absolutely can do that, absolutely. Cheshire Coroner can get evidence, can confirm who are interested persons, absolutely. But I think the scope of the final inquest hearings, if they go ahead, needs to be expanded. And I think it needs to be a more senior, a judge maybe, you know, that oversees it, completely separate from Cheshire Police, completely far, far away, because there are question marks over their investigation.
Yes, if that helps, I don't think you are overthinking it. I think your conflict concern is legitimate. So it's great that you're airing it here. Now, we've had a number of questions and comments from our listeners about the upcoming inquest, and I wonder whether you could help us address some of those, just to clarify a few points. Now, I'm going to read their comment without filter, so apologies for that. Some of them are a bit, but yes. So one is this: with regards to the reported parental request that the cause of death be changed from natural to unlawful killing, I wonder if the family's lawyers are not only pushing for the serial killer narrative, but also exploring every possible avenue to obtain maximum compensation if unlawful killing includes gross negligence manslaughter. Do you have any background on compensation? And would that be more or less depending on the findings?
Yeah.
I don't have
No,
a background on
I
this.
don't. I mean, I am aware that families can be represented, especially when there are concerns against the hospital, and that may include compensation. But as to compensation amounts, and motives for compensation, I wouldn't be able to comment on that. I think it may well be that they could get more for, yeah, unlawful killing, gross negligence, manslaughter, but they'll probably get nothing if it turns out that the cause of death is natural. I do wonder if pressure has been put on the Cheshire Coroner to issue fresh death certificates, which I think it should happen after a criminal court, really because of the public record. It should happen in most cases. But in this case, it almost feels like, are they doubling down? Are they concerned that the convictions are going to be overturned, and is that going to mess up any compensation claims? Potentially, yeah. But I don't know if this is what the families are actually really wanting. I don't know if maybe there's been even there could be pressure on them by lawyers who have their own conflict of interest, having been linked to the prosecution,
Yes.
and also the police, because it's best for their reputation for their original narrative to stand.
Yes, and their
Anything that disrupts
interests.
that, they don't like it. It doesn't look good for them at all.
Indeed.
So yeah, so I can't really answer that, but
No.
well, have in a way, but not that much. So yeah.
No, thank you. That gives some understanding, a little bit more than what we were able to afford anyway. Now, the second one is this not the biggest procedural cock-up so far in our so-called justice system? Having inquests after a conviction, seriously? I have no words for our feel about how the British justice system today. Now, we haven't actually focused on that, but
Mm.
why is it that an inquest should be stopped, let the criminal proceedings go, and then be reopened again after that? Is it right, in your view? Wouldn't you think that the coroner will have more medical experience, for
Mm.
example, to find that finding rather than a criminal court?
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, I don't know the strict legal definition because I'm not a lawyer. But generally, I think it's to do with the criminal court and the burden of proof, and if that threshold is met, then that takes precedence. But for these cases, really, the cause of death, the accurate cause of death, should have been established first via the coroner, and that did not happen. I know because I was there. The police just steamrolled ahead with it. They occasionally let the Cheshire Coroner, the then Cheshire Coroner, Mr. Moore, they updated him, but they were like, it's more of a, this is what we found, we're right. And in effect, it trampled all over the previous coronial conclusions. Now, you might expect that if there'd been, say, a multidisciplinary panel, like the National Crime Agency advised Cheshire Police, and if that included a forensic pathologist who had then consulted with the paediatric pathologist, that never happened.
No.
It was down to a single retired pediatrician who was arguably not clinically up to date. And I remember the coroner was never told that. The coroner was told, we found this method of murder. This is where we're going. This is the direction we're going in. We're looking at, eventually criminally charging somebody. And as far as I'm aware, those original paediatric pathologists were never consulted. That's the first thing the coroner would have done. And had I been given more than 3 hours to do my review, I would have chatted to each of those paediatric pathologists saying, could there be anything else that's been missed? Could there be anything? And as far as I know, I don't think they were ever consulted. And that's the problem. The police have gone too tunnel vision. They've adopted a narrative, and a narrative I think has come from the consultants at the Countess of Chester Hospital. And then they've seen an opportunity. And I don't know if I've answered your question, sorry. What I wanted to say actually about this, so having an inquest after a conviction, I think it is a really good opportunity to highlight how the criminal court have not really sufficiently established what the true cause of deaths are. I think that's the most crucial thing. And I think it also opened doors to allow Lucy Letby's representation to get disclosure that the police have refused to disclose. For example, the updated report by Dr. Dowie Evans about baby C. the police, as far as I know, I could be wrong, as far as I know, they're refusing to share that report. Well, that's relevant to the cause of death of baby C. And if that inquest is being opened next week, then really that should be
It should be
disclosed to the
disclosed.
defence. It should have been disclosed anyway. I don't know what they're trying to hide, but that should be disclosed. And then also information pertaining to the Liverpool baby should be disclosed as part of the disclosure provisions under the Coroners and Justice Act 2009. So I think while some people are like, well, what's the point? The coroner's just going to say unlawful killing. Well, actually, like with the public inquiry, that scope is so narrow that is arguably a waste of money. Sorry to Thirlwall, but that is arguably a waste of money. The scope should have been expanded, absolutely, to prevent wasting so much time and money. But that has enabled disclosure, and things have been found out because of that disclosure via the public inquiry. So people might think, what's the point in the public inquiry? Well, actually, we've had disclosure, which is pointing to innocence. And I think the inquest may do the same thing. I hope so anyway.
Yes, so I agree with you that in the end, actually, an inquest on an inquiry after criminal proceedings, so be it with all limitations, can give us an opportunity to see more into what actually happened, even if the restrictions on final conclusions have to confirm what the criminal court says. And also that disclosure could help for future CCRC application. That is important for the person who still believes has been wrongly convicted.
Yeah.
One final question. It will be interesting to see how the coroner will reconcile the original cause of death established by post-mortem examination, back up now by Mark MacDonald's dossier of expert evidence submitted to the CCRC, with the opinion on one long retired pediatrician whose opinion shaped the prosecution case and has been roundly criticised. From a medical standpoint, it is a no-brainer. It is a no-brainer, but as we said, there is a limitation. So
yeah, and I think this is, I have written to the Chief Coroner highlighting this very point. The multidisciplinary panel, Shuley's panel, almost a year ago, 4th of February 25, those findings are more consistent with the original colonial findings. And I've written to the Chief Coroner saying I'm concerned as to how easy it was for the police to just trample all over those previous findings, and then they've got this retired out of practice paediatrician to then invent new cause of death, which where I question the scientific basis as to how he came up with those, and he's now doubting himself, though he publicly said, I'm not so sure now, and that just seems to have been brushed under the carpet by the police and the prosecution. So I'm very curious, and this is why I think there needs to be a change in the law, and I think there needs maybe a change in the Coroners and Justice Act as well. I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, but I have said, could it be revisited to prevent this from happening again in the future? All those coronial investigations have just been pushed to one side. They're no longer important. We've got this great expert who said that they were all murdered, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to dig up her garden. And so I'm very curious as to how that's going to be tackled. And that's why I think there needs to be full separate hearings. And to be fair, the public inquiry probably should have covered that, but the remit's so limited that it won't cover it. So you're having all these different hearings. The poor families. I wish I could talk to these families. I just wish I could try and help them make sense of everything that's happened. But I fear that they're too influenced almost by the police narrative, and that's what they now believe. And I feel so awful for them, what they've been through. And if I ever could talk to them, my offer is there. I know the police won't allow it, but my offer is there if I could ever sit down and talk to them, what I think has happened. But we shall see.
Finally, to wrap up our conversation, what do you most want families and the public to understand about how inquest and criminal proceedings sit along each other, and why both processes matter?
Yeah, so ideally a judicial system will be a hybrid, inquisitorial and adversarial. At the moment, we've got two different things. So the police are all adversarial, police and CPS adversarial, the coroner inquisitorial. And I think for complex death investigations, there needs to be a collaboration. The coroner should have been an active participant, in my view. I know the norm is not. The police will do their investigation and the coroner will step to one side. But for this investigation, it should have been a collaboration. There should have been discussion about, right, okay, who are we going to get to look at these causes of death? And I can't speak for the coroner, but I'm sure the coroner would have said we need more than a retired paediatrician. You know, we need a multidisciplinary panel. I think that's what the coroner would have said. That's what I've said in the past about previous cases I've looked at when I've asked Cheshire Police to have another look. So I think even there, appointing the right expert should have been a discussion with the coroner, because it's looking at the cause of death, which is the coroner's judicial function. So there is a place for both processes, absolutely, but it's got to be done right. And the end goal has got to be to reach the truth. And then, if justice is required, then get justice. But they've skipped the reaching the truth bit in their investigation, Cheshire Police and CPS. They've skipped that bit. They've just gone straight to prosecution and let's get a result. But as part of that, reviewing the cause of death, that should have included the coroner, a forensic pathologist and other specialties, a panel, and it didn't. So I think what the inquest will probably do is now highlight those weaknesses in the original investigation. I do think Lucy Letby will be exonerated, but I think it's more trauma for the families, and they may end up suing the police, they may end up suing the CPS. We don't know. It's just never ending. Their grief is on hold whilst all of this is going on, and they've got yet another process to go through. So my heart is with them. I think this is just making their trauma even worse, everything that they've had to go through these past 10 years.
It must be unbearable.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that you would like to leave our listeners with, a message?
Only that I don't know if there will be final inquest hearings. I hope there will be, and I hope this is to establish the truth, and I hope that there is sufficient independence away from Cheshire Police. I am confident that we will get to the truth. The truth has a way of coming out eventually. And justice and the right thing happens eventually. So I think there is hope. I really do think there is hope.
Brilliant. Spoken Injustice is all about hope. So thank you for helping us unpack this so clearly and so thoughtfully. And we hope to see you again in this channel soon.
Okay, yeah, great.
Lovely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
So, if we step back and try to summarize what we have covered today, one of the key things we have learned is that coroners, inquests, and criminal trials are fundamentally different, and they differ in several important ways. To begin with, inquests are inquisitorial. The coroner leads the process, asks the questions, and seeks to establish the facts. Criminal proceedings, by contrast, are adversarial. The prosecution and the defense test the evidence against each other before a judge and a jury. They also operate to different standards of proof. An inquest works on the balance of probabilities, whereas a criminal trial requires proof beyond reasonable doubt, a much higher threshold. And their purposes are different too. An inquest is concerned with who the deceased was and how, when, and where they died. A criminal trial, on the other hand, is focused on whether a specific individual committed a criminal offence. At first glance, it might seem logical or even preferable to have a single process to establish what happened when someone dies. But in reality, that simply isn't workable. Criminal trials are governed by strict rules of evidence and procedure. They exist to protect the accused, to ensure a fair trial, to safeguard fundamental rights, and to minimize the risk of convicting an innocent person. An inquest, by design, does not and cannot operate within those same safeguards. Once we accept that two distinct processes are necessary, the next question becomes, which should come first? Common sense might suggest that the cause of death should be established before any criminal proceedings begin. And that is often what happens in civil cases, but criminal cases are different. For a coroner to determine the cause of death, they may need to examine evidence in a way that lacks the procedural protections of a criminal trial. That creates a real risk of prejudicing later proceedings. For that reason, it often makes sense for the criminal process to come first. But as we know, that in turn creates another tension. Once a criminal trial has concluded, having applied the highest standard of proof, the inquest that follows is constrained. It cannot revisit findings that have already been determined beyond reasonable doubt. So the real challenge is not choosing one process over the other, but how the two can be made to coexist, each respecting the limits and strengths of the other. Criminal trials exist to determine guilt and to protect individual rights. Inquests exist to establish facts, provide the transparency, and crucially identify lessons that may prevent future deaths. They answer different questions for different reasons and in different ways. The tension between them is real, but it is also unavoidable. The task then is not to eliminate that tension, we can't, but to manage it carefully, ensuring fairness for the accused, meaningful answers for families, and public confidence that deaths are being properly examined. Given that some degree of imperfection is unavoidable, we may have to accept that the real value of an inquest does not lie in the breadth of its remit, but in the possibility that new or previously unexplored facts may emerge during the process. It is the emergence of those facts, rather than the formal scope of the inquest itself, that can give the process its significance. Information that comes to light in this way may, in some circumstances, prompt further scrutiny of earlier criminal proceedings, for example through an appeal. For that reason, even where an inquest is limited in what it can formally determine, it can still be important. Its impact might be indirect, but it can nonetheless contribute meaningfully to the pursuit of clarity and justice. I hope that this episode has brought some clarity to a process that's often misunderstood, explaining what an inquest is meant to achieve, where its limits lie, and why it still matters. Thank you for being with us, and if you'd like to support the work we are doing, please remember to like, subscribe and share this video and help us to continue our mission to humanize the criminal justice system. Join us again as we sit and rise in this unique trial.